I want to talk this morning about Lewis's interest in mysticism. People often think of C.S. Lewis as the Lord's logician. Mere Christianity, he very methodically talks about people's misunderstandings about faith. He talks about the moral law and how we all abide by it, whether or not we realize that we do. And he goes on very logically to move forward in his defense of the faith in Mere Christianity. Even in some of his literary books, such as Preface to Paradise Lost and Experiment in Criticism, you could really sense the rational progression of ideas from his premises to his developing arguments until you get to his conclusions. So sometimes people are surprised. I didn't notice it until I was writing a book called The Most Reluctant Convert about his spiritual journey to faith from childhood to his early 30s. And I kept noticing he's reading William Hilton or Julian of Norwich or the Theologica Germanica. And I kept saying, these are not all logical apologetics. A lot of these are people who feel they've had a direct experience of the divine. So as more I looked into it, the more I was convinced that that's a side of Lewis that people need to be aware of. So an example of this, at the Waite Center, we have Lewis's books from his library. We have about 2,500 books. And the ones that are the most fun to look at are the ones that he annotated. And the green book, which he talks about in The Abolition of Man, we have that book, and it actually is green. And you can see him get more and more irritated with what the authors are saying until he had to write The Abolition of Man to try to refute their thesis. This one is by Samuel Butler, who wrote The Way of All Flesh. And he says, he's talking about the idea of God. For so long time, it was without foundation and a piece of dreamy mysticism only. And Lewis wrote in the margin, "This man is a fool. Mysticism points to a reality not yet met." So you can tell by his comment in the margin that he's open to the idea of mysticism, of practicing the presence of God, of having an encounter with the divine apart from knowing about God or studying theology. So I want to talk a little bit about this side of Lewis, which is often overlooked. In a letter to an American fifth grader about, is there some way to get to Aslan's country? Can we be like Reepicheep and take our boat to Aslan's country? And Lewis responded, "The only way for us to get to Aslan's country is through death, as far as I know, though perhaps some very good people get just a tiny glimpse before then." So most of us don't feel like we'll encounter God until the afterlife. But he's suggesting to these children, some very good people, I think he's thinking of mystics and saints, some people he really admired, may get a glimpse before then. So there's an openness to an experience of the divine presence in your life in a way that some people might find unusual in Lewis. In other books, just sprinkled throughout his books, you find passages talking about the difficulty of understanding God in terms of strictly rational terms. In Surprised by Joy, his memoir, "Into the region of awe, in deepest solitude, there is a road right out of the self, a commerce with the naked other, imageless, though our imagination salutes it with 100 images, unknown, undefined, desired." So he's talking about something here beyond just reading the Bible and developing a clear understanding of who God is. He's talking about something that we're still striving for and trying to move more closely toward. And a lot of mystics, they're really trying to, some of them are spontaneous. Paul on the way to Damascus did not expect that encounter. Other people, there's a kind of cultivated mysticism where people like Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross, they have a very specific program for trying to feel the presence of God in your life much more vividly. Lewis said in the letter that our spirit is a lens through which we look at God. And the more you can shine up that lens and get rid of smudges and fractures, the more you're going to have a better lens through which to look at God. In a letter, Lewis says, "God speaks not only for us little ones, but also to great sages and mystics who experience what we only read about, and to whom all the words have different, therefore richer contents." So we can read about theophanies in Scripture, but some people, they've actually had an experience that he never considered himself to be a mystic. He said, I'm a person of the foothills. Even in hiking, he didn't like heights. And so he used that as an analogy. He didn't really aspire to the spiritual heights, but he wanted to learn from those who he felt had been much higher in their spiritual journey than he'd been in seeking to discover God in their lives. Some definitions of mystical experience: a direct experience of God, as immediate as a taste or color. You can study theology and say, here's my concept of God. You can be very moved by a beautiful hymn and say, my whole emotional life is being drawn to the beauty of being in a relationship with God. But he thinks there's something more direct and existential and immediate that can happen to a person. And he always used the word taste, usually to mean a direct experience of something. When Jane meets Ransom, it says she tasted kingship for the first time. She had a direct experience of what it might be like to be in the presence of royalty. It's interesting with colors and taste. If you look up in a dictionary a color like yellow, how do you define yellow to a blind person? Literally in dictionaries it says the color of a ripe lemon. But if you've never seen a ripe lemon, you really don't know. There's an argument in philosophy about someone who was an expert on blue, and she knew all the wavelengths, she knew all the things that were defined as blue, but she herself was blind. Would she know blue? She knows all about blue, but she hasn't experienced blue. And so there's, Ludwig Wittgenstein said, how can we describe what the divine is like when we can't even describe the aroma of coffee? Often words fail us. And I think that's true. Think about how you would describe the aroma of coffee. And you really have to have the direct experience to know what that is. Evelyn Underhill, who both Lewis and T.S. Eliot admired, called mysticism the direct intuition or experience of God. Intuition means literally the knowledge within. Experience literally means out walking around, perimeter, peri. Experience literally in our lives. When we're out walking around in our lives, we have some kind of encounter with God. R.M. Jones, a Quaker scholar on mysticism, said, a mystical encounter may change a person's thinking from these are my beliefs to this is the reality with which I should align myself. It's not necessarily a matter of new information or new knowledge. It's a matter of taking what had been kind of inert knowledge and turning it into a living existential knowledge. That's what many of the mystics report in their discussions of their experience. And so I think in some ways his interest in mysticism fits in with his own sense of progressive revelation. I just took this outline, I made it myself from a number of different sources, but he did have this feeling that historically people were getting a clearer and clearer image, understanding of who God is. One time when I was still teaching back in Pennsylvania, my campus was very near the Susquehanna River, and there was this very thick fog, soupy fog. So I was in the faculty parking lot. I'm going toward the English department building, and I hear a twig crack. And so my first sense is there's something living out there. On this campus, it could have been a deer. It could have been a dog off the leash. It could have been Mr. Multitude. You never know in Pennsylvania. We do have bears wandering around that part of Pennsylvania. So at first I had a sense there's something living there. As I came closer, I could see the outline of an upright human being. So I decided, it's that living being is a person. And as I came closer again, I said, it's female. I could tell from the height and the profile that it was a female ahead of me several yards. And as we got closer, it was one of my colleagues in English named Mariah. And I said, what are you doing out here in the middle of the fog? And she said, I forgot my grade book, so I'm having to go back to the parking lot to retrieve my grade book. And I said, you better drop some breadcrumbs so you can find your way back to the English building. But as I thought about it later, it was a kind of analogy of growth in Christ or the mystical experience. I was never wrong. There was a living being there, but later I realized it was a living being who was a person, and then I realized that person was a woman, and I realized that woman was my colleague and friend. So there's some kind of a progressive revelation there, going from a literally foggier understanding of what's in front of me, or a less focused understanding, getting more and more detail and more clarity about that. And sometimes our spiritual journey can feel that way. So Lewis was a great believer in general revelation, in the sense that God gives us a lot of clues as to his nature. Paul talks about that in Romans. They have no excuse because of all the, and I love the phrase in Ecclesiastes about God has put eternity in their hearts. And Lewis would certainly affirm that statement. So I would say, roughly speaking, even before you get to special revelation, even before you get to the Bible, you have the cosmos itself. The heavens declare the glory, which he quotes in Out of the Silent Planet. The immensity of the cosmos, Lewis says in Mere Christianity, that's a kind of image of God. That's the garment of God. It's immensity. It's seemingly almost infinite is a analogy or an allegory of God's nature. So we see the beauty and the order of the cosmos. I remember when you read about Kepler and Newton, they were amazed that planetary motions were so logical and so mathematical. You see all these stars and planets whirling around, and suddenly Kepler had a pretty simple formula saying, well, if you know this weight and their distance, I can predict that it's going to be an ellipse. I can tell you what the orbit of that planet is going to be. And a sociologist named Peter Berger said that for these early astronomers, it was like looking up at the heavens and realizing that they're playing a game of chess. This one moves like a queen, this one moves like a pawn, this one. And so there's some fascinating correlation between simple human mathematics and the actual way that celestial mechanics reveal themselves in the heavens. So we have the cosmos, the Tao, universal moral principles. He talks about this extensively in The Abolition of Man. There's this fabric of moral teachings which give us a lot of revelation about the nature of the universe. Originally, the first chapter of Mere Christianity, he was going to call right and wrong as a clue to the universe. There's a moral law that everyone has. I love his openings. Lewis is a master of openings. Some rhetorician should write Lewis's openings and closings. At the beginning of Mere Christianity, we've all heard an argument like, oh, that was my seat, or I gave you a piece of my orange, why won't you give me a piece of your fruit? And he says that even if they're amusing or annoying, they tend to assume that people have a moral law or a moral understanding, and they also assume that we all break it. So before you even get to Scripture, you've already gotten to some sense of moral universals, in some sense that none of us live up to the universals that we ourselves ascribe to. So we have the cosmos, the Tao, good dreams, the dying God myths and other stories that God somehow has given cultures an understanding of the need for redemption. Somehow God has got to enter into the picture to redeem a lost world. Sehnsucht, we've talked a lot about the sense of longing, the sense of unsatisfied desire, which is actually more desirable than any other desire. A sense that there is paradise, but we've been kicked out of paradise. We're trying to get back to that paradise which we were made for. And then lastly, numinous experiences. He was a great admirer of Rudolf Otto. He wrote a book called The Idea of the Holy, which was one of the four that Lewis said near the end of his life was most influential in his thinking. Rudolf Otto's The Idea of the Holy, Dorothy Sayers' The Mind of the Maker, and The Everlasting Man by Chesterton. And the fourth book was by another theologian named Edwin Bevan. And he was talking about metaphors for God. And Bevan said in most religions, height and light and agelessness are associated with the divine. When you go to the Narnia Chronicles, Aslan's country is way up there. Sometimes Aslan disappears in this swirling gold. And agelessness, of course, he's always the same whenever you meet him. Even though he gets bigger, as the Pevensey children understand him, he seems larger. That's because the lens of their spirit, more and more they see the greatness of Aslan. So it's interesting that he really wanted to talk about numinous experiences as a clue as to the God who made the universe and who made us. Finally, you get to Hebrew scriptures, and he develops this most clearly in Pilgrim's Regress. The Hebrews, they suddenly realized this sovereign God, this awesome God, this infinite God, was also a holy God. He had expectations. If you really want to worship me, love mercy, love justice, do the right thing, take care of the poor. And he says the Hebrews were the first ones to connect the sense of good and evil, or right and wrong, with the awesomeness of God. He not only created the universe, he also created our ethical systems and our understanding of right and wrong. And then it took the New Testament to realize that the true myth was going to become history. And God was not only a moral God who had expectations of us, he was also the redemptive God. He knew that by the law, we could not fulfill his expectations. So he had to take our place. And once again, he reenacts that idea in Aslan's Sacrifice in Narnia. I think I made this outline just from different books. Some of you who are looking for a master's thesis or dissertation, I think you could take this diagram and turn it into a whole book. You could talk about general revelation and the different things in the different places. He talks about ways in which God reveals himself in our hearts, but then talk about how the Hebrews were the first to realize, the shepherd people were the first to realize that he was also a holy God, and then finally the righteous one who gave himself for humans. When I say the numinous, this term was coined by Rudolf Otto. His book's called Das Heilige. And he says, not only in scriptures, but in other classical texts, we have people having these encounters, fear, awe, holy dread. You get a taste of it in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, where the beaver says, Aslan is on the move. And the children don't even know who Aslan is, but they all feel something jump inside of them. And it's all in nature, it's all correlated to their own character. Lucy says it's like finding out you woke up and school's over. Lewis hated school. You notice one of the things at the end of Prince Caspian, the Pevensey children are going to be wonderful monarchs, and one of the things they do is kick all the kids out of school and let them go play and turn some of the teachers into trees and things. So for Lewis, for her, that was a numinous experience. The only one who has a feeling of dread at the name of Aslan is Edmund, because we know his spiritual state is such that he's going to feel a natural opposition between where he is and where Aslan wants him to be. Fascination, attraction, yearning, majestus, a sense of ineffable magnitude. I was giving a lecture on this once and said, have you had some of these experiences yourself? And heard some very touching and poignant stories about incidents in someone's life where they felt God was extremely close. And this one student said, oh, for me, it's the opening of Star Wars. This little rocket is being shot at, and then this gigantic battle cruiser shows up on screen. Do you remember the very opening of the first Star Wars movie? And I had to admit, I knew what he was talking about. Somehow that sense of immensity and ineffable magnitude came up. Now, Lewis wasn't an uncritical student of mysticism. Jacob Burma, who he read, and when he read it, he says, this has given me the biggest shaking up since I read Phantastes. But Burma got off into some very eccentric ideas that were not orthodox. And later, Lewis said of this particular mystic, you know, if he said he'd if he said he'd experienced unutterable things, maybe he shouldn't try to utter them. He wasn't happy with someone who felt that the experience of God went so far beyond language that you couldn't even measure whether or not it was orthodox. Urgency, energy, intense dynamism, like stored up electricity. Rudolf Otto gives the example in the Old Testament where the soldier is trying to steady the Ark of the Covenant when they're carrying it back to Jerusalem, and just touching it, he instantly dies. It was so sacred. That was such a symbol of the divine that it was like grabbing onto a high-powered wire. Wonder, astonishment, stupefaction. You know, men of Galilee, why do you stand there looking up at the skies? They're just almost paralyzed with the intensity of what they're feeling and of what they're experiencing. Mystery, absolute unapproachability. So these are Otto's definition of the numinous experiences, and Lewis felt we all have those, and when you're within the Christian community of faith, you have a much better understanding of why you're having these experiences. You have a much better sense of what it is that you're encountering. Lewis loved theophanies in Scripture. Most of the famous ones that you learned about in Sunday school, Lewis includes somewhere in one of his books. Moses and the Burning Bush. In Letters to Malcolm, Lewis says, as you develop your understanding of God more deeply, every bush is a burning bush. Every bush is a miracle. He says the world is crowded with God. As your sensibilities become more and more developed, all of nature seems to be sacred, not just the burning bush. Elijah and the still small voice. Where do we have a replication of hearing the voice calling you? I'm going to say when Lucy and Prince Caspian in the night she keeps hearing her name called, and she comes out in the night and she encounters Aslan. That's when she says, "You're so much larger than I remembered." And he says, "Well, I haven't changed. Your ability to understand me and receive my identity has changed." So we have a kind of a reiteration of, I skipped I skipped to the third one. I'm thinking of the boy Samuel hearing his name called in the night. Elijah in the stillful voice comes up in one of his literary works. He talks about how people love that passage, and they say, "Oh, the beauties of King James prose." And he says, "Well, you could." Does anybody remember the exact phrase? "First there was a fire, and then there was an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake, and he was in the still small voice." And someone said, "Well, even though I don't believe the Bible, I love the rhythms of biblical prose," and I gave that example. So Lewis comes up with an alternate sentence was, "First we had tea, then we had pie, but the pie was not good, but I liked this." And he took the exact same rhythm for a very trivial sentence, and he was trying to point out that the power of that incident comes from the content of this encounter with God, not from the rhythms of the prose. He really didn't like people talking about the literary merits of the King James. He said, the more you talk about the Bible as literature, the less influence it has as literature. You're not treating it anymore as a great source, a great fund of insight. Isaiah's vision of the Lord of hosts attended by seraphs crying, "Holy, holy, holy." Anybody think of an incident that sounds like Lewis is echoing that scene in Isaiah? Do you get to ask questions in a speech like this? You're going, "We're not in class. We don't have to answer. There's not going to be a quiz. Answer your own question." I think in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, when they go visit Ramandu, and these birds come from the sunrise and bring him live coals, and with every coal that they touch to his tongue, he gets a little younger. And when he gets young enough, he can become an active star again. Reminds me very much of the vision of Isaiah. Paul's encounter on the road to Damascus. Lewis was defending Charles Williams' idea of co-inherence. Charles Williams believed that we all, just as the Trinity co-inhere, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we as the children of Christ co-inhere in Christ, and we co-inhere with each other. We're members of the body. Paul says several times, carry each other's burdens, do this for each other. And someone said, well, that sounds kind of heretical to me. I'm not sure if I'm sure the Trinity co-inheres, and I'm sure that we co-inhere in Christ, but do we really co-inhere in each other? Is there a spiritual connection among Christians? And Lewis said, to defend his friend Charles Williams, when Paul was on the road to Damascus, he heard the voice of Jesus say, "Paul, Paul, why do you persecute me?" Instead of saying, "Why do you persecute my followers? Why do you persecute Christians?" And Lewis thought that was evidence that Jesus felt very much the pain of his followers being persecuted. As I say, every one of these dramatic theophanies or encounters, the vision of the new heaven and the new earth, very much he draws heavily in the last battle. He throws in some Twilight of the Gods, but a lot of the theology at the end of the last battle comes from the book of Revelation. These are different mystical writers that Lewis referred to or quoted, starting with Augustine. Augustine, once again, is thought of as a great theologian, but in the Confessions, he talks about his mother Monica and he are at Ostia, port city near Rome. And together they had this experience of being elevated toward the heavens and leaving the world behind and leaving their bodily burdens behind. But it was very transitory. Just as they were almost feeling like they were going to ascend into heaven, they fell back to earth. And it's a very mystical passage in what's otherwise a pretty straightforward memoir. A great critic of mysticism named Bernard McGinn calls Augustine the Prince of Mystics. He was the first theologian who was not just talking about God, but talking about his own experiences of God. I'm not going to go through this whole list, but all of these were mentioned by Lewis one place or another. The Theologica Germanica, he starts out the problem of pain with the Theologica Germanica. This mystic said, the great battle that we feel is not between God and Satan, it's between the God self and the I self. We have the ego, pride, selfishness, desire for our own comfort, our own affirmation, and then we have the God self who says you may need to leave that behind. And Lewis several times quotes the Theologica Germanica. I call it that because the unknown author was from Frankfurt, and sometimes they say this great theological treatise by the Frankfurter. And I think that's a mistake. You know, I'm just going to go with Theologica Germanica. He also quotes it in Christ and Culture. Sometimes he sneaks them in so unobtrusively, you don't realize he's talking about a mystical writer. He says, I had to learn from old Walter Hilton not to be too hard on myself, that often we need to apply grace to ourselves. And he doesn't explain that Walter Hilton was a famous English mystic and father of an English order. Thomas à Kempis, you can go through the list there. Teresa of Avila. He has a funny quote in one of his letters. When Teresa of Avila was called upon by Christ to create a new order, the Discalced Carmelites, which is the simple Carmelites. The Discalced means you're not wearing shoes. You're going to live simply like a Franciscan monk. And Teresa felt that Christ came to her and said, I want you to start a new order which has not been corrupted by materialism and pride and hierarchy. And I want to call them the Carmelites. And Teresa of Avila says, well, I just don't think I'm up to that. I don't think I'm the right person, Lord. And she felt this as a very vivid encounter. And Christ said, well, this is the kind of thing I ask of my friends. And Teresa of Avila said, well, maybe that's why you have so few. And I feel like you've got a pretty strong relationship with Christ if you can give him back talk. You know, apparently give him a little pushback. But Lewis thought that was amusing, and he talks about that in one of his letters, that she actually felt she could have direct dialogue with Christ. So I wrote a book called Into the Region of Awe on this subject, and one of the reviewers, every one of these I quote where Lewis talked about them in a book or a letter, and the reviewer said, Downing never convinced me that Lewis had any interest in mysticism. And I was thinking, how much evidence do you, all these names, it reminded me of that old Simon and Garfunkel song about a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. I felt a little bit that way about that review. But in any case, if you go through his books systematically, you'll find a lot of references to mystics and a lot of sense that he personally was being spiritually nourished by mystics. The mystical way, the modern writer who probably made mysticism most publicized, brought a heightened awareness to the mystical tradition in the Christian church was Evelyn Underhill. And she said the mystical way is a general journey of the soul, and many people go, what's the word I'm looking for? They intentionally and mindfully seek to take the mystical way. The awakening of the soul to divine reality. When Lewis wrote about Ransom going to Mars, and suddenly the heavens are radiant, they're full of life, they're beautiful, he never expected that. Evelyn Underhill was in the last years of her life, and she wrote a letter to Lewis and said, I just love that passage. She thought that was a perfect illustration of the awakening of the soul to divine reality. She said in her book that sometimes people first awaken to the nature of God, and suddenly they love creation. They say, look at the beauty around me. Look at what God has made. The heavens declare the glory. Other times they have an awakening to the beauty of nature, and they say, well, I need to find the creator of this wonderful nature. So she said it can go both directions. But for Ransom, he suddenly discovers the beauty of the heavens. Purgation and elimination. Purgation is purifying those things in you that would keep you from drawing closer to God. Illumination is that great new insight or that new perspective, or taking the abstract theological statement and turning it into a vivid existential reality. And she often said these go back and forth. It's not you do all purgation and then all illumination. Often there's a journey of several years in which you're alternately learning how to move away from the I self and move toward the God self. Finally, often there's a culmination, the dark night of the soul. This phrase comes from St. John of the Cross. And it's important to realize that the word dark in Spanish doesn't just mean bleak, grim, midnight. It means oscuro can also mean obscure. We don't understand what's happening. And this is really a culmination of the sanctification process in which you're really faced with the death of the self. You've been, it's like Eustace in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. He's trying to scratch off all these outer layers of dragonhood. And finally, Aslan says, I think I need to do that for you. And it hurts a lot. He takes his claw and gets rid of all the dragon skins. That's kind of an example of the dark night of the soul, when ultimately that part of his nature needs to be removed if he's going to continue growing in his relationship with Aslan. And then union, communion, walking with God. The final stage that mystics strive for is a sense that their will is not wrestling with God. Their will is walking with God. What God wants is what they want. Jesus says, if you ask these things in my name, you will receive them. And George MacDonald said, well, the reason you will receive them is the things you're asking are so close to the Spirit of Christ. Your spirit is already in accord with what Christ wants. So of course you're going to receive what you're asking for. And he felt that promise was really for people who'd grown so close in cultivating their God self and killing their I-hood that they could literally ask for things and God would, of course, acknowledge them because that's what he wants for you as well. I love the story I wanted to mention with Augustine. He's a brilliant rhetorician in North Africa. He's got a mistress. He's kind of a hellion. And his Christian mother, Monica, is praying, please. He starts saying, I think I need to go to Rome. That's the real center of things. North Africa is kind of the boonies. And so he's talking about going to Rome. And his mother, Monica, says, please, Lord, don't let him go to Rome. I've barely got him under control when I'm nearby. But if he goes off to Rome, who knows what's going to happen? So she very fervently prays that Augustine will not go to Rome. Her prayer is not answered. He goes to Rome, and there he hears St. Ambrose preaching. And he goes, this is brilliant. This is eloquent. This is perceptive. This is true. His whole life is transformed because he went to Rome. And it's a great image of prayer where we're kind of telling God, you know, if I'm going to get this young man straightened out, he can't go to Rome. And God, he answers her prayer in the long term in the most significant sense, but he has to deny her prayer in the literal sense. And I think that's part of that illumination and purgation. Sometimes we have to get ourselves out of the way in order to allow God's will to flourish in our lives. I talked about this passage yesterday. This is the one that Evelyn Underhill really liked, The Awakening of the Soul to Divine Realities. And she wrote him about it. She died soon after. It's one of those might have beens. I would have loved it if they had had this rich correspondence over the next decade or 15 years, but it wasn't meant to be. Now I want to talk a little bit about the Ransom trilogy. I argue in my book that Ransom is actually enacting the mystical way without realizing it. He has this awakening to the heavens when he's on the way to Out of the Silent Planet. There's a lot of talk about his anxiety. And finally, when he talks to the Archon, the Oyarsa of Mars, of Malacandra, he says, you really only have one besetting sin, and that's anxiety. You're constantly not confident that Melildil, you're walking in his will. So he's starting to grow out of his anxiety. He must, because now he's going to go in Paralandra, he's going to go to Venus in a coffin. That sounds a little bit symbolic to me. I would rather have had the spaceship. He's going to lie in a translucent coffin. He goes to Venus. Now he knows he's on a mission, and he knows he might die. He says to the Lewis character, accidents apart, something might happen and my mission may not be fulfilled. So he overcomes his anxiety. Once he gets there, he's piebald. He was in a translucent coffin, and half of his body is sunburnt and half of it is pale. And it's a symbol of his dual nature. Yes, he believes in Melildil. He wants to follow Melildil. But you still got the old Adam in there along with the second Adam, the Christ nature being part of Ransom's nature. And he keeps stressing his dual identity. And at some point, he argues with Weston and says, don't listen to him. He's lying. He's a serpent. He's trying to get you to fall out of your rapport, your relationship with Melildil. And finally, he says, you know, this isn't about rational argumentation. We're going to have to do combat. We're going to have to do single combat. And he's very angry with Melildil. He says, you know, I'm not this muscular fighter. I'm not this, you know, why in the world would a middle-aged professor be having to do physical combat with this serpent of Paralandra? And he finally realizes, even if I'm killed, I need to follow Melildil's will. At this point, he's figured out that the unman is actually Satan. At one point, the unman screams, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. And Ransom says, he wasn't quoting, he was remembering. Lucifer was there at the cross, and he suddenly realized that he'd been double-crossed, that he didn't understand what the whole crucifixion and resurrection was about. And right before he goes into battle, they're going to go at it tooth and claw and biting and scratching. But he looks down at his body, his piebald nature is faded. In being willing to fight to the death to complete his mission, he's suddenly gotten past these resentments and these anxieties in the sense that Maleldil didn't have a very good plan here. And then he spends 3 days underground. There's a kind of symbolic death of the self. After he kills Weston, he spends 3 days trying to climb back out of the cave. And then he comes out on what he calls a holy mountain, which is straight out of Dante. When Dante comes out on the holy mountain, he literally sees the great white rose of paradise. So I wanted to go back to a mystical moment on Out of the Silent Planet. He's talking to Hoyoi, this Harasa, and the Hoyoi says, "I will tell you a day in my life that has shaped me. Such a day comes only once, like love, or serving Oyarsa in Meldalorn. Then I was young, not much more than a cub, when I went far, far up to the Handermont, the highlands, to the land where stars shine at midday, and even water is cold. A great waterfall I climbed. I stood on the shore of Balky the Pool, which is the place of most awe in all worlds." There's that word awe. That almost always means a sense of numinous encounter in Lewis. "The walls of it go up forever, and huge and holy images are cut in them, the work of old times. There was a fall called the Mountain of Water. Because I stood there alone, Maleldil and I, for even Oyarsa sent me no word, my heart has been higher, my song deeper all my days. There I drank life because death was in the pool. That was the best drinks of all save one." Which one? "Death itself, the day I drink and go to Maleldil." And even though it's paraphrased, I think what Hoyoi is saying, "Death itself, the day I go to Maleldil," he's saying basically Paul's formulation, "For me to live as Christ, to die as gain." So there's a biblical echo in Hoyoi's description of this experience he had. And then when we go to Paralandra, once again we have mystical overtones. This is an unfallen world. At the beginning of the problem of pain, Lewis wonders if Adam and Eve were the first mystics, because they could talk directly to God. He would walk in the garden, and then obviously that relationship is broken after the fall. But on Paralandra, they are still in direct relationship to Maleldil. And when he tries to talk about his experiences on Malacandra, she knows about it. She says, "Maleldil has given me images of Sorns and these great spidery creatures." And she also knows about what happened on Earth. She understands that God's son, Maleldil the Younger, had to go to Earth in order to redeem that planet. Now, she couldn't know this from Ransom, or she didn't get this information from Ransom. She said Maleldil put these images into her mind. So she's a kind of practicing mystic there in this unfallen world. And the same thing happens to Ransom. He starts out on his own, not quite sure what he's supposed to do. At one point, he feels this presence. And at first it's very oppressive. He can have a sense that his spirit is being crowded by some infinite spirit. And he says sometimes when the present left, he wanted to take out a cigarette and put his hands in his pockets, then he remembered he's naked. But there's a sense of being in the presence of God is kind of overwhelming. But as he develops and talks to the Green Lady and argues with Weston, he has a greater and greater sense of Maleldil's guiding. He has an inner advisor that says, "Don't go through the bubble tree twice. Don't eat the red heart berries twice." And keeps giving him advice. And at some point, the presence becomes a face, and then the face eventually becomes a voice. And the voice is the one that says, "Well, I am also called Ransom. What you're doing is a kind of reenactment of what I did on Earth." And there's a greater and greater spiritual clarity as to what he's doing on Paralandra as the novel progresses. Well, that's what I said there. Maleldil as a presence, then as a face. Well, that's insightful. That's exactly what I say. So this is one of these great images of the Green Lady. More and more on the internet, you have artists who are trying to decide how to illustrate the Ransom trilogy, and some of them are quite striking. Hal and I found the same one where he's on the floating island with a bubble tree, and he sees this great woman. It's quite an evocative image. Moving to that hideous strength, now Ransom's become, he's walking with God. He's very much in accord with what God and the angels want him to do. There's a sense that he's overcome his struggle. He's reached the state of union with God. But Jane Studdick certainly is not. She's a rather embittered intellectual in an unhappy marriage. But going to St. Anne's, she becomes more and more to understand the spiritual world, the spiritual dimension which underlies our everyday world. And finally, about halfway through the novel, she realizes that her interest in Melville and Ransom has turned into a major paradigm shift. Her life is very different than what she thought it was. So she says a boundary had been crossed. She had come into a world, or into a person, or into the presence of a person. Something expectant, patient, inexorable met her with no veil or protection between. This demand which now pressed upon her was not, even by analogy, like any other demand. It was the origin of all demands and contained them. In its light, you could understand them, but from them, you could know nothing of it. There was nothing, and there had never been anything like this. And now there was nothing except this. In this height and depth and breadth, the little idea of herself, which she had hitherto called me, dropped down and vanished, unfluttering, into a bottomless distance, like a bird in a space without air. That's quite a bit more vivid description, saying she weighed the pros and cons and she decided that there actually might be a Melville, or this is not an intellectual conversion necessarily. Her whole being, the whole cosmos is different than what she thought it was. And I think his description of her change reminds me of a scene where he's riding on a bus in Oxford, and he suddenly has this feeling that there's a door open before him. And for him to go through that door is going to change his whole life. And he has a lot of strange metaphors. He said, I felt like a snowman that was melting. I felt like a knight who was taking off his armor. And even he is struggling to find the right metaphor for what's happening in his spirit at that moment of reorienting himself toward God. And he loved to take his own experiences and translate them into some of his fictional characters. So I believe this wonderful prose is a reflection of what happened to him personally on that bus back out to the kilns. Don't you love the phrasing? In this height and depth and breadth, the little idea of herself, which he hitherto had called me, dropped down and vanished. Once again there, the phrasing, somebody help me with height and depth and breadth. Somebody shouted out here. I need some navigators in the group. When I talk to navigators, they know these Bible verses. Yeah, when Paul says, may you experience the height and depth and breadth of God's love. Yeah, that's Paul. Yeah, that counts. Okay. Well, in any case, he's cleverly taking what Paul wishes for his fellow Christians, and he transposes that into the language of Jane's conversion. It's interesting that Paul prays constantly for the people he's writing letters to. And he doesn't say, I'm praying for you that you won't undergo so much persecution. I'm praying for your health. I'm praying that you can overcome your financial strains. His prayers for the people he's writing to is virtually all, can you understand the depth of God, the height and the breadth and the depth? I pray that you will experience the richness of his being. Now, Paul himself was called into the third heaven at one point, and Evan Underhill calls Paul the first mystic. Whatever happened to him, he brought that power back to his ministry with those he was working with on his missionary journeys. Okay, so I think that is my last slide, but I wanted to let you know about this side of Lewis, which is often overlooked. I think a lot of the power of his faith came from this existential sense of God's presence in his life, not just feeling there are wonderful arguments for Christian faith. So that is... Thank you very much. Appreciate it.